This is a list of the different journeys that the saints took to Missouri in the 1830s. And the ones with an asterisk by the year are times when Joseph Smith was on the journey. Today we're going to focus on 1834 and the journey of Zion's camp, and Joseph Smith and Hyrum leading two different groups that are recruiting people to help them with that journey. So the first revelation the prophet received when he arrived in Kirtland directed that Joseph Smith should have a house built in which to live and translate. So as he's preparing for Zion's camp, it's been 3 years since he's received this revelation to build a house, and he's been trying to get the house built, and that, of course, is now a visitor center just north of the Kirtland Temple that opened recently. And so in the fall of 1833, they moved into this home. And it's from this home that he would have left on Zion's camp in 1834. So he was concerned for the suffering saints that had been driven out of Jackson County in 1833 and had gathered around Liberty, Missouri, and along the Missouri River, and were suffering. And they were, of course, hoping to get back to Jackson County and their property and the lands and homes that they left there. So when that word comes to Joseph Smith, this is the word of the Lord concerning his saints, that they should assemble themselves together in the land of Zion, not in haste, lest there should be confusion, which brings pestilence. I, the Lord, will that you should purchase the lands. If it be by purchase, behold, you are blessed. If it be by blood, your enemies are upon you, and you shall be scourged. So one of the challenges the saints faced in those first 3 years in Jackson County is some of them came in haste and not when Joseph Smith asked them to, and that caused some challenges with too many saints, trying to find places for them, and the local people. One of the reasons they were driven out is because they did not follow this counsel. Joseph and Emma's home that he lived in and was his office and where he worked from as they tried to build the Kirtland Temple from 1833 to 1838 was right here in this modest home. And he would often have meetings here, and this is where they talked about Zion's camp. And of course, Emma lives there. This home was the center of not only Joseph Smith's family life, but the church government. Translation of the Book of Abraham began here. Emma completed the compilation of the first hymnal, and important meetings of the First Presidency, the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, and the First High Council were all held in this home. Emma gave birth to a son, Hyrum Smith, in this home on June 20th, 1836. During their time here, the Smiths also hosted many visitors, friends, and recent converts. So it was an important place for the family as they gathered, but also a church headquarters for, in a sense. In 1834, the church was still young, less than 4 years old. Membership was probably around 2,000 to 2,500, with approximately half of that number in Missouri, and another 600 to 800 living in Kirtland and northeastern Ohio. The remaining 300 to 400 resided in scattered branches, primarily in Pennsylvania, New York, Michigan, and in Canada. Joseph Smith himself was a young, youthful 28, his wife Emma 29, their children were young. Julia, their adopted daughter, was almost 3. Joseph Smith III, his namesake, was just over a year old. The Kirtland State Presidency and High Council. Joseph Smith, Sidney, and Frederick G. Rowan, serving as the church first presidency, were also chosen to serve as the presidency of the Kirtland Stake, and 12 additional high priests were selected as counselors. Based upon what they were told by Missouri officials, leaders in Missouri believed these 3 things. The state would render assistance by mustering a militia force that would help them go back to Jackson County. The saints were authorized to organize their own independent military unit, which body would join forces with the state militia in helping restore the saints. After the saints were reinstated, the LDS military would remain for a time period to protect and maintain order and peace. So this is what they believed as they organized Zion's camp. When Elders Parley P. Pratt and Lyman White were asked when they arrived in Kirtland in February of 1834, following a lengthy midwinter journey from Missouri, the two men informed Joseph Smith of the latest developments in connection with the exiled members. The two men delivered a letter written by William W. Phelps informing the prophet that, quote, the governor is willing to restore us, but the Constitution gives him no power to guard us when we get back. Clearly, the Missouri Saints were asking for the Kirtland members to come to their assistance and help them get back to Jackson County. 2 days after their arrival, Joseph Smith received a revelation reiterating the previous one, instructing the saints to organize companies of 10s, 20s, and 50s, and hundreds, which we know as Section 103. Joseph wasted no time in moving forward with his plans to organize the camp, and on the 26th of February he left Kirtland in company with Parley Pratt to recruit volunteers. They traveled east to Ohio and New York, and others would also help recruit. In April, Willard and Zerubbabel Snow and Jacob and Joseph Mary Snow Gates left Vermont for Kirtland to join Zion's camp and marched to Missouri, Liberty, Missouri. Mary was one of 12 women who went with 200 men and 9 children in that 1,300-mile journey. So many of these recruits had to leave New York and Vermont and get to Kirtland before they could start the journey to Missouri. And these are some of my ancestors, the Snows, that went with them. During the course of the 2-day conference, Joseph, Oliver, and Zebedee experienced the most unusual vision. Joseph laid on the ground, and Oliver and Zebedee rested their heads on his outstretched arms. The heavens gradually opened, and they saw a golden throne, and on the throne were 2 aged personages, having white hair and clothed in white garments. These personages were the 2 most beautiful and perfect Zebedee Coltrane had ever seen, and Joseph called them our first parents, Adam and Eve. This is Wilford Woodruff, who was recruited on Zion's camp. He had been taught in New York and baptized the end of December when they cut a hole in the ice. Parley P. Pratt recruited men on April 6, 1834, and Wilford Woodruff was ready to leave on the 11th, 350 miles from Richland to Kirtland. After he arrived, he met Joseph when he was tanning a wolf hide, and he was very impressed with the prophet, and a day later, Wilford Woodruff heard Joseph teach. And so this is one prophet training a future prophet, but they don't realize that at that time. On this journey, Wilford Woodruff would have traveled about 25 miles a day. Shortly after his arrival, he met Joseph for the first time. Wilford's recollections of the meeting were as follows. I first met Prophet Joseph in the streets of Kirtland. He invited me to his house. He had a wolf skin, which he wanted me to help to tan. He wanted it to sit on while driving his wagon. Now, many might have said, you are a pretty interesting prophet, shooting a pistol and tanning a wolf skin. That was my first acquaintance with the prophet. And so Wilford Woodruff loved Joseph Smith and got to know him very well on the journey to Ohio. I would have been in this home with Joseph inside, which this home has been restored and is there right north of the Kirtland Temple. On Sunday, on April 27th, they were in a small log schoolhouse, and Joseph said, you know no more concerning the destinies of this church than a babe upon its mother's lap. It is only a little handful of priests that you see here tonight, but this church will fill North and South America, it will fill the world. There will be tens of thousands of Latter-day Saints who will be gathered in the Rocky Mountains, and there they will open the doors for the establishing of the gospel. This people will go into the Rocky Mountains, and they will be there, build temples to the Most High God. So, Wilford Woodruff quoted this in General Conference in the 1890s, but it has been quoted in the most recent conference and many other conferences of Joseph's prophecy of the church going to the Rocky Mountains and throughout the world. And so here's a small church, a small group of men, and Joseph is teaching them just 4 years after the church was organized about the movement. Now the church had 3 different names in the 1830s. It was called the Church of Christ for the first few years. Then in 1834 they decided to distinguish themselves from many other churches called the Church of Christ, and it was called the Church of the Latter-day Saints. On April 6th in Missouri, it received the official name which we now use today. But those are the 3 names of the church. And when Zion's Camp left, it had been changed to the Church of the Latter-day Saints. Here is the Kirtland Temple, House of the Lord, built by the Church of the Latter-day Saints in 1834. So that's the official name they were using. Of course, it's obvious to us nowadays that it's missing the most important name, and that is Jesus Christ, whose church it is. So here we see the Doctrine and Covenants printed in 1835 in Kirtland, and it's the Church of the Latter-day Saints in the cover of that book. So Joseph and Hyrum are doing what they did in 1831 with missionary journeys. Joseph is going to go this way from Kirtland and recruit and gather, and Hyrum is going to go this way like he did in 1831 and recruit and gather. And then they have agreed to meet at the Allred settlement, where many members of the Allred family have joined the church, and not go any further until they arrive there. And that works out for them because they know they're going to meet there and get organized. So you can see they kept very detailed records of the different places they stopped and on what day they stopped and what happened. Hyrum's division has 44 people as he's leaving. Joseph's division has 185, and they're trying to get over 200 people. Originally, the Revelation asked for 500 people, but they did not get that many. Joseph would not allow himself special privileges that were not also available to his men on Zion's Camp. He ate the same food they ate, he walked the same distances they walked, he slept in the same tents they used, and he refused special treatment. At noon, the prophet discovered that part of the mess had been served with sour bread, while he had received good sweet bread from the same cook, whom he reproved for his partiality, saying he wanted his brethren to fare as well as he did, and he preferred to eat his portion of sour bread with them. So that's an example of how Joseph tried to be humble and a servant leader with them as they make this journey. Going about 30 miles a day, so if they're walking 3 miles an hour for 10 hours, that's going to be their average distance. They face many challenges with mud up to their knees sometimes, of course there's heavy rain in the Midwest, and they had other challenges too. Many times they stopped on the Sabbath, sometimes they didn't, depending on the circumstances and where they needed to be. They were following a national road which was built from 1811 to 1837 from Maryland to this part of Illinois, and so there is a place that they're following and a well marked out road with many of the places that we know in our day as they're going across the country. In Jacksonville, Illinois, on June 1st, Sabbath, 6 sacrament meeting speakers were chosen. Joseph Young spoke about free salvation. He was a Methodist. Brigham Young on the necessity of baptism. He was a Baptist. Orson Hyde, a remission of sins, a Reformed Baptist. Lyman Johnson, keep the Sabbath day holy, a Presbyterian. Orson Pratt on the restoration of all things, and he was a restorationist, those that believe in the restoration of the New Testament church. And Eleazar Miller gave a powerful exhortation in a loud voice, and you could hear him for a long ways away. Squire Cook was the leader, which was a name Joseph Smith used. So they are marching through, sometimes having meetings and people joining with them to hear what they're talking about. They cross rivers as they go, and they've got to cross the Mississippi River, and Joseph is going to cross at Louisiana and come into the Allred settlement. And Hyrum is coming from here and will cross near Quincy and go through Taylor, Palmyra, Missouri, and then come down into the Allred settlement area near Paris, Missouri. And so they are making their journey and getting closer and closer. On June 4th, Joseph wrote a letter to Emma from the Mississippi River while they wait for a ferry. They're at Louisiana and they're crossing over into Pike County, Missouri. I embrace this opportunity to fill up this sheet to you, my beloved companion, remembering your request to write to you while on the road. I want you to make use of the money I sent you in wisdom for such things as you need, and to make yourselves as comfortable and contented as you can. Tell the children to remember the passage of Scripture which says, "Children, obey your parents in all things." So Joseph is trying to lift up his wife as she's caring for the children in his absence. So the Salt River branch, which is the James Allred family near Paris, Missouri. These are some of the Allreds that joined Zion's camp and helped grow the number. James Allred, he's the homeowner. Isaac Allred, his son James. Martin Allred, his son James. Andrew Whitlock married one of the Allred daughters, and Robert McCord, living in the Salt River. He will die of cholera on Zion's camp not long after they get there. So from June 9th to June 11th, they're at the Salt River branch and trying to get organized and ready to go. Hyrum had arrived there on August 4th in 1831 and stayed a week and taught the gospel to the Allreds and their 12 children. And now many of them have joined the church, and Hyrum and John were there for a time before they met Joseph when he was coming back from Missouri, not far from them. The Allred family, James and Elizabeth, and then Isaac and Mary, William and Sarah. So there's this couple, and this couple. And in Family Search you can see all of their children and the ones that went, and their children, the ones that went, and their children. So the Allreds were a big family and a large family that helped the saints. And Joseph and Hyrum would stop there as they come and go across Missouri. William and Elizabeth Taylor, 12. Joseph Taylor had just turned 9 on June 4th. He met Joseph Smith when Joseph's Zion's camp stopped for a few days. He said, as a 9-year-old, "When I first saw him, I believed he was one of God's noblemen, and as I grew older, I became thoroughly convinced that he was a true prophet of God." So here's a 9-year-old meeting Joseph Smith, the prophet, for the first time, and he never forgot how he felt or how he looked at Joseph Smith. This is William and Elizabeth Taylor, and there's a family named John Taylor, and of course that's a common name in those days, not the John Taylor that came from Canada and became a prophet. Alan Taylor, Julia Taylor, and so you have the Allreds, the Taylors, and many others that are here and helping out. Parley Pratt and Orson Hyde are now going to go 50 miles a day. Joseph sent them down from where they were with the Salt River branch, or the Allred branch, down to the governor, Dunklin, to talk to him about the militia that was going to help them when they get to independence. And then they agree that they will move on and that they will come back and report as they move along the journey. And so Parley Pratt and Orson Hyde jump on their horses and go a long way south, about 75 miles down and 75 miles back in 3 days. So it's about 50 miles a day on a horse. And much like the Pony Express years later we've been doing. They did not bring back good news, but they And you can see here the Salt River is coming here, but then you've got all these other rivers coming down into the Missouri River, the Grand River that comes from Adirondack area. And these are important waterways that they will cross as they're going across Missouri. So this is a close-up view of those as they go down to Jefferson City, and then they come back up here, and will be along this river when they report. And Joseph and Hyrum and the others are marching this way, headed over to Liberty, Missouri. This is the missionary work that they did as they went across the country. They came to 320 acres owned by William and Bernita Hickman, 2 miles west of Moberly, Missouri. They treated the marchers kindly and invited some of them into their homes for dinner and gave them fresh water. Both were in their 20s and were baptized members of the church and sold their farm in 1838 to move to Illinois. And so there are good people in Missouri all along the trail. Some have joined the church, others haven't. But we do hear about those who drove the saints out of Missouri, but we need to remember all the good people that were kind to them. How much food and water would you need for over 200 people? It's just amazing the help they received. Okay, as they travel about 20 miles a day, they're getting closer to the fishing river, and this is June 12th through the 19th. And they're leaving Paris and going on their way over past Cairo, Missouri, down through near Brunswick and Miami, Carrollton. This is a road that we still travel when you go on 24 highway to Paris, Missouri. You're following the route of Zion's Camp. They come into Richmond and then eventually over into what is now known as Excelsior Springs and then down to Liberty. Camped just east of Richmond, Joseph was troubled and seemed uneasy about their campsite. The next morning, the camp rousted earlier than usual and passed through Richmond. After having gone through safely, they learned of a mob was garrisoned in the city with the intent to attack. But the saints had passed by too early. So Joseph got up intentionally and left early to try and avoid that mob that they had heard was coming. And on June 19th, they may have been camped near Hardin. They'd come along this way, whereas in modern day there's a railroad. They'd gone through Norburn, Hardin may have camped out here somewhere, and then we're going through Richmond, where they had water provided by miraculous, and then they're going on their way over here. The Crooked River comes in through Richmond. On June 19th, at a farmhouse, they got milk for free after they needed some food. After lunch, they had many delays. They had a broken tongue on the wagon, a wheel fell off another wagon, a harness broke on some mules. And as we look back on that, we can see things that they probably can't see, but they, I'm sure, were frustrated that these things kept happening. And their goal was to get to Liberty that day, and they would not get that far because of these delays. And sometimes we have challenges in life that delay the places that we think we should go and do. And then when looking back, we see that it was the hand of God in our lives, and that we are going to be, with these delays, right in the places that we need to be when God is watching out for us. So with those delays, they are now going to just be here and not getting to Liberty like they thought. And it's because they're in this location with those delays by 8 o'clock that night that they will be between the two forks of the fishing river and protected from the mobs and difficulties that are coming. The storm from the records started about 8 and went at least 6 hours of heavy rain. And this is one fork of the fishing river, and this is the other fork of the fishing river. And they're between these two forks, and that's where they were protected. And these two rivers rose 30 to 40 feet and protected them from the mob. And there's a video you can watch online about that, about 15 minutes, them being protected from the storm. After the storm, and as they waited for the waters to recede, they went a few miles north along the fishing river, and Joseph met with Sheriff Gillum, Colonel Scones, and Judge Ryland, and agreed to negotiate instead of using force. So this is a picture of the area up by the pasta plant where the John Cooper farm was along the fishing river. In modern day, there's a big pasta plant there and an open field near where the saints would have gathered and spent several days waiting for the Zion's camp, waiting for the waters to recede and to get a plan. This is a picture from Joseph Smith papers of the peace agreement that they made, that they wouldn't fight and that they would settle and not go into Jackson County. It's on Sunday, June 22nd, in this area near the John Cooper farm along the fishing river that section 105 is given. And it's written here, Revelation given June 22nd, and it's worth reading that whole revelation that was given there and what God told them and what they learned as they camped there in what is now modern day Excelsior Springs, but that town didn't come until years later. In consequence of the transgressions of my people, mine elders should wait a little season, that my people may be taught and endowed with power. I have prepared a great endowment and a blessing to be poured out upon them, inasmuch as they are faithful. I have heard their prayers and will accept their offerings, and it is expedient in me that they should be brought thus far for a trial of their faith, lift up an ensign of peace. And so in section 105 we learn that they were not going to be fighting because of transgressions. This is similar to section 101 of why one reason the saints were driven out of Jackson County. And at this point God wants them to return to Kirtland and finish the temple and be endowed with power. And so the focus is on the temple as they finish up here in Missouri and return to Kirtland. But they have been with Joseph for a long time. They've learned a lot of things. Joseph got to know the people and they got to know him. Now they're going to make their journey 13 miles from Fishing River, where they were on John Cooper's property, over to Liberty, just 2 miles east of Liberty, jail and Liberty, on Rush Creek. They're going to settle near the Sidney Gilbert home and others that had settled there along Rush Creek, and Sidney Gilbert and others will help them with food and necessities as cholera breaks out. Sidney Gilbert and the Burkett family were the ones that settled here 2 miles east of Liberty. This is a monument that lists what happened there and the names of many people that, those that died. So this is Sidney Gilbert, and he had a store in Independence, the Gilbert and Whitney store, and he is one that died. So he wasn't on Zion's camp, but he took them in and caught cholera from them and passed away. This is John Murdoch's little girl, Phoebe, and she will die of cholera. And so there are many descendants of these good people that died that are in the church today. One of them served with us as a missionary couple and often took people and family out to remember that. So Joseph Smith and Hyrum were also sick with cholera and thought that they would die, but Hyrum had a vision of his mother praying for them on this journey of Zion's camp, and because of her faith and prayers, Hyrum reassured Joseph that they would recover and move on. But here's one of Joseph Smith's family members, Jesse Smith, that died, a young man, and so this monument is in the cemetery in Independence, where 3 of the people that died, their skeletons were found along the Rush Creek and moved to this area and buried in Independence. In conversation with some of the veterans of the march, the prophet Joseph Smith indicated that he had received a vision of those who had given their lives as part of Zion's camp. I have seen those men who died of the cholera in our camp, and if I get a mansion as bright as theirs, I ask no more. As the prophet shared this experience, he wept and was unable to speak for some time. And so this is a reassurance that those who gave their lives during this time, Joseph Smith said that they would be blessed for the sacrifice they made. Some records indicate that on Tuesday, July 1st, after Joseph Smith recovered, he made a journey quickly across the Missouri River over to Jackson County to see what was going on there, and then returned back from Independence back over to the Liberty area. So there's a monument now along the Missouri River called the 8 Witnesses Monument. It has 4 different sides to it, but one of them is an honor to the Arthur family that helped the saints that were driven out of Jackson County and settled around his farm. He employed them and helped them get shelter and money, and they built him a nice brick home. But on July 3rd, Joseph Smith organized the state presidency for Missouri and also dismissed officially Zion's camp and said they could stay and settle there. Some of them intended to do that, and others were going back to their families in Kerman. But they weren't going back as a group. They're going to split up and go home in smaller groups. This is the Missouri presidency or state presidency for the saints in Missouri: David Whitmer, W.W. Phelps, and John Whitmer. So they will lead, and there's also the High Council that are called. Lyman White was on Zion's camp. William McClellan was in the High Council, and he was called to the Quorum of the 12. Thomas B. Marsh would be president of the 12 Apostles a few months later. Parley P. Pratt was on Zion's camp and called to the Quorum of the 12, as was Orson Pratt. John Murdoch was on Zion's camp. And so in July, on July 3rd, this church organization was made. There's a Kirtland Stake Presidency and High Council, and now there's a Missouri Stake Presidency and High Council. And many of these will be people that were on Zion's camp with Joseph, but they will only be serving in this High Council for about 6 months, because in February 1835, the Quorum of the 12 was organized and they're called to serve. Nathan and John Joshua Tanner traveled with Zion's camp. Their father, John Tanner, put in nearly half the money for Zion's camp. Nathan and Josh ran into financial trouble on the return journey. A local farmer named Eldridge inquired where they were from and where they were going and invited them to dinner. The young man continued their journey, and within a few weeks the farmer visited the John Tanner home and stayed 2 weeks. Eldridge and his son John were baptized members of the Restored Church, and one son, Horace S. Eldridge, was baptized and became a general authority in 1854. So these members of Zion's camp were doing missionary work, and Nathan and John Tanner were part of that camp. And John Tanner was a wealthy businessman that joined the church and helped with Zion's camp and also with the Kirtland Temple. Some of you may have seen the video called The John Tanner Story that shows his life. So as the Zion's Camp is finishing up and returning back to Kirtland. They're going to make that journey in the month of July, a very hot and humid month in that Midwest area, averaging about 37 to 40 miles a day. So in about 3 weeks they will be back. Some would take steamboats, some don't. Zion's Camp was a trial of faith. So if Zion's Camp had not succeeded in reclaiming lost property in Missouri, the Lord revealed for the members of Zion's Camp the expedition had been a trial of their faith. The difficulties faced by members forged resolution and loyalty in many, but others quarreled and complained. It was later became apparent that future apostles and future apostates would walk at the same trail, side by side. Among the faithful Zion's Camp participants were 8 or 9 of the original quorum of 12 apostles, all of the original quorum of 70, and 2 future prophets of the church. So one of the purposes of Zion's Camp was for Joseph to get to know the people that could be called to leadership positions and serve the Lord. That wasn't easy for them to see, but it is easier for us to see as we look back. In February 1835, the prophet asked Brigham and Joseph Young to assemble the veterans of Zion's Camp for a mission reunion of sorts. The prophet laid his hands on the heads of the 3 witnesses to the Book of Mormon, whose responsibility it was to select the 12 apostles. After the blessing, the witnesses retired from the group for about an hour and then returned with the names of those chosen. 8 of the original 12 apostles had served faithfully during the trek of Zion's Camp. And so 8 members of the quorum of the 12 apostles were also on Zion's Camp: Lyman Johnson, Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, Orson Hyde, Luke Johnson, Orson Pratt, William Smith, Joseph's brother, and Parley P. Pratt. So many were called to the quorum of the 12, and 70 were called to the quorum of 70. So that is an important piece of church history, as the saints were going to Zion's Camp and the leaders of the church were called. As we look back on Zion's Camp, we can see that God had many purposes in mind that were not obvious to them. Brigham Young had learned how Joseph would organize a group of people to cross a long distance, and Brigham didn't realize this, but within 4 years, when the saints were gathered near and around Far West, Joseph from Liberty Jail would ask Brigham and others to organize the saints and lead them out of Missouri over into Quincy area and up into eventually Nauvoo. And that experience for Brigham and Heber and others of Zion's Camp and leading the saints out of Missouri looked like difficult experiences, and they were challenging things. But that laid the foundation and groundwork for Brigham as he would, a few years later, be asked to lead the saints out of Nauvoo, Illinois, across Iowa, and across over to Utah. And so what God was doing in many of these church history experiences in the 1830s was preparing his leaders for important responsibilities in the future. And that is part of what God was doing for them at that time. So the journey of Joseph Smith and Hyrum in 1834 is an important part of church history and all the lessons learned with Zion's Camp. It will be an important year in 1835, as they call the Quorum of the 12 and the 70. And many of the saints in Missouri will come up during 1835 and help finish the Kirtland Temple and be there in 1836 for the dedication of the Kirtland Temple. And then as leaders in Missouri return back to Missouri with the fire of the temple experience in Kirtland, as they return to the Far West area and dig a foundation in the middle of the city for the Far West Temple. And then a year later, Joseph will come and they will dedicate the cornerstones that are still there today for the Far West Temple. And so in the journeys to Missouri, the first 3 years were in and around Jackson County as they tried to build a temple there. The next 3 years from 34, 35, and 36 were in and around Liberty in Clay County, and they again were focused on the temple, finishing the Kirtland Temple, and we're not trying to finish or build the one in Jackson County anymore. Then for the next 3 years in Far West and Adamant Island, they were focused on trying to build the temples there in Far West, and hoped to build one in Adamant Island, but were driven out. And so 3 years in Jackson County, we're focused on the temple. 3 years in Clay County, we're focused on finishing the Kirtland Temple after Zion's Camp. And then 3 years in the Far West area as they tried to build, focused on building the temple there. And so through the 9 years of Missouri, it seems obvious from us looking back that they were a temple-focused people. They wanted to worship the Lord in His holy house, and they were trying their best. And none of those temples were built in the 1830s, but of course the Kirtland, Ohio temple was built, and they had to leave that one. The Nauvoo temple was built, and they had to leave that one. So it's obvious that they were focused on temples. It's also obvious that Satan opposed those efforts, and that is true in our day today. As President Nelson has focused on the Savior and His holy house and announcing more than 200 in His first 7 years, and yet there's opposition in various places where temples are announced. Cities and people sometimes don't want a temple in their community, but hundreds are being built, and we see the work going forward now in our day, which was done in the 1830s in Joseph's day during Zion's Camp, before and after Zion's Camp, and all that God did for them at that time. So another time we will look at 1837, Joseph Smith's journey to Missouri,